New England, a story of religious descent and the subduction of the Native Americans. So, as you know, we've already reviewed the three cultures that came together at the beginning of the process by which Europeans subdued the North American continent and made it colonies, subservient to the will of the European maritime empires. Now, we're going to start looking at some of the earliest colonies in what would later become the United States of America. So let's begin with New England. So, one thing that's important to remember is that New England was founded by the Puritans. Just a quick review of Puritanism. So Puritanism is a Protestant sect of Christianity. Particularly, it's a Calvinist sect of Protestantism. And they tended to add a belief in predestination. Now, predestination is a belief by which they have... So Puritans believed that at the beginning of time, God created all the souls that would ever be. He saved a select few at random who became the elect and were destined to be saved and join God in heaven. The rest were all damned to hell. Now, it was believed that those who were among the elect would find it irresistible to be righteous, and as a result would eventually become Calvinists. Now, the Puritans had a disconnect with the Anglican Church. So Puritanism is a Calvinist sect in England, and they have this disconnect with the Anglican Church. And the reason for this is that they thought the Anglican Church was too Catholic. So the Anglican Church, for those of you who are finding Global 10 a little bit long ago, a little fuzzy, Global 9, Global 10, we talked about Protestant Reformation. Anglicanism is the Church of England. And that was the church that was founded by King Henry VIII when he wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope refused to allow it. So he wanted to marry this other woman by the name of Anne Boleyn because she was pregnant, and he thought she was going to have a son who was going to be his heir. She ultimately didn't, but at any rate, Henry decides to form his own church. And because the Church of England is only founded for political purposes, he doesn't really reform it too much, and so many of its rituals and practices remain very similar to Catholicism. And the Puritans disliked that. And because of this, they were persecuted by the English government, because Anglicanism, the Church of England, was the official religion in England. Now, the Puritans were often nicknamed the Grimms due to their prohibitions of many forms of entertainment. The Puritans banned cockfighting, which was a practice by which people would enrage live roosters and would get the roosters to fight each other. They banned bear baiting, which is when dogs fought bears for public entertainment. The Puritans also banned theater. You were not allowed... When the Puritans would eventually seize control of England during the English Civil War, they closed the Globe Theatre, where Shakespeare had once performed his plays. They even banned Christmas. They felt Christmas was too pagan. So that's the Puritans for you. Now, the Pilgrims were a separatist sect of Puritanism, and they were persecuted by the British, and they have initially fled to Calvinist Holland, where other Calvinists were. However, they found Dutch culture to be too corrupt, by which we would now mean fun. The Dutch, though they were still Calvinists, tended to tolerate a lot more celebrations and frivolities than the Puritans were okay with. So eventually these pilgrims, they charter a voyage which was originally bound for the English colony of Virginia. However, the ship was blown off course and arrived in the Massachusetts Bay instead. This ship, you will all remember, is the Mayflower. So, settling in Massachusetts. So the Puritans settled down, the Pilgrims settled down, and they initially almost die of disease. They're not familiar with planting in the New World, and almost die out were it not for a Native American by the name of Squanto, who taught the settlers how to grow corn, which is a crop that really was more common to the Native Americans at this point in history, but would eventually come to become a staple of America. The English colonized America and then later the United States. Now, one interesting trick that Squanto taught them was to bury fish along with the corn seeds, since the decomposing fish would act as fertilizer. This is, of course, your famous Thanksgiving story about Pilgrims and the Native Americans having a feast and mutual blessing, etc., etc. Happy times! Happy times! No. But initially it is a fairly amicable relationship between the Puritans and the natives. So what causes this to sour? Well, eventually more Puritans are going to arrive in Massachusetts Bay Colony, especially after the restoration of the British monarchy at the end of the Lord Protectorate period under Oliver Cromwell. So when that happens, more and more Puritans leave England for the New World. And as they do, more and more land is cleared for farming. Now, here's the deal. You need that flat open space to farm. But flat open spaces tend not to be places where deer and other woodland critters live around, which is not good news if your society depends heavily upon hunting, which the natives did. And so this began to cause conflicts as more and more Puritans start showing up and more of the forests get cleared away to make room for farmland. Now, the Puritans didn't help matters because they believed the natives to be damned. Right, remember, go back to predestination. They believed that at the beginning of time, most of the souls were damned, and the elect would find righteousness irresistible. So as a result, the righteous were generally believed to be Puritans. So the natives, which is a great many, and they're obviously not Puritans, were held to be damned. And because of this, this leads to wars and massacres for which the Puritans express no remorse. The reason for it is that they believe these people are already damned. If God has given up on these people, then why shouldn't they? If they're already going to hell anyhow, what difference does it make how we treat them in this life? That's the Puritan mentality. Now, various groups would set off on expeditions expanding the Massachusetts Bay Colony into what is now New Hampshire, Maine, and Connecticut. And those dissatisfied with Puritan religious laws, many disliked the fact that as more and more Puritans came, the laws of the Massachusetts Bay Colony tended to reflect the religious beliefs of the Puritans very strongly, and those who disliked that eventually broke off and founded the colony of Rhode Island. Now, paranoia. So, the first thing that's important to understand here is that the Puritans had a mindset of persecution. They believed themselves to be the few righteous people existing in the world, in a world full of sinners that only want to oppress them because of their religious beliefs. They're suspicious of sinful England, the sinful Anglicans who are still too Catholic for their liking. And this suspicion is very important because this is one of those things about why Massachusetts is so anti-British. So even before everyone else, all the other colonies, start getting on this anti-British kick, New England already doesn't like England because the Puritans think of the English as sinful and decadent. Now, like a lot of people, they had a fear of the devil, demons, and witches. And because they believed that the Native Americans were damned, and because of the wars they often had with the natives, they also had intense fear of the Native Americans. So this creates a very tight-knit, very paranoid world. You're constantly looking out for those who will persecute you. You're scared of the forest because that's where the Native Americans are. You believe that the devil is out to get you, and so his servants, the demons and the witches, are also going to try and come after your community. So that's a problem. So, the Salem witch trials. So in the midst of all this paranoia, the daughters of the town reverend fall into fits and hallucinations. And eventually they start giving out accusations that women in the town were tormenting the girls as witches. Now, what makes this very difficult is that witch trials of the period relied on a practice called spectral evidence. See, it was believed that witches committed their acts by means of a specter, a spirit or a projection of themselves that would attack someone, and often could only be seen, it was believed, by the person casting the specter and the person being attacked by the specter. Now, spectral evidence is a different. So the idea was that in a trial, someone could testify about being tormented by someone or their specter. And this became an issue because this meant that pretty much just on any one person's word or accusation, that could carry the force of undeniable evidence. It's pretty hard to refute spectral evidence when once you've decided you're going to accept it, the very nature of it is something that only the guilty party and the victim can see. Now, as a result of this, there was also torture was allowed as a method to extract confessions. One gentleman by the name of Giles Corey was killed when people, they put rocks on top of his chest in an effort to try to get him to confess to witchcraft, and he refused. His last dying words were, "More weight," refusing to give in and refusing to confess. Now, besides people being executed and dying as a result of torture, you also have the issue that those who were convicted lost their lands. Even those who were not hanged lost their lands and property. So what were the motivations? What made Salem go into this fit? Well, one is the hysteria and paranoia I pointed out earlier. The other issue is financial gain. Remember, those who were accused and convicted lost their lands and property. So if you wanted to get at someone or wanted to take their land, accusing them of witchcraft was a good way to get the court to confiscate their land, and then you could later buy it off the court. It was also a way to settle personal grudges. You always hear cases about neighbors that are in the midst of feuds and they're always calling the cops on each other. Well, this was the equivalent of that then. You accused your neighbor of witchcraft in an effort to punish him for whatever it is you didn't like that he did. There was also an interesting degree that it was noticed that many of the accusations came from farmers and were hurled at the members of the merchant class setting up in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this dichotomy may have reflected anxieties about the incoming merchants versus the established farmers. And finally, in a lot of societies throughout Europe and the Americas, particularly Europe, we see this phenomenon, so it's not entirely impossible that it was happening in Salem as well. It's a manifestation of guilt over the demise of traditional social safety nets. As mercantilism is taking hold and more people are making money through trade and not through traditional societies of self-help networks that were common in the medieval village, many of the poor began to slip through the cracks of a shrinking social safety net. And people often felt guilt that they weren't doing as much to help the poor as previous generations. And this guilt often manifested itself in the form of a fear of the poor and the destitute. So that's a fear of the poor, the widows, and of course, think about the image we eventually get of the witch, this old crone, this old widow. So the economy is a mercantilist economy. That means it was focused very much on the transatlantic trade.